Good afternoon. Our speaker, Craig Whitlock, will address drones. Can they revolutionize aviation without endangering safety and privacy? And Craig has written for the Washington Post since 1998. He covers national security and the Pentagon. In recent years, he has specialized in writing about drones, focusing on how they have revolutionized military warfare overseas and are now transforming civil aviation at home. Craig first attracted our attention last June with his three-part investigative series that for the first time documented the hazardous safety record of drones. The series exposed hundreds of major crashes around the world and how the Pentagon and FAA have sought to keep such accidents a secret. We thought you would be interested in this important topic, and we knew after reading the series we had found our speaker. Before his current assignment, Craig served for 5 years as the Berlin bureau chief and investigated and reported on terrorism, networks, and counterterrorism policy in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. He's reported from more than 50 countries. He received the German Marshall Fund's Peter Weitz Prize for a series on terrorist networks in Europe. He has 3 times been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, most recently in 2013 for the in-depth coverage of the Obama administration's secretive drone operations overseas. Prior to joining the Post, Whitlock worked for 7 years as a reporter for the News and Observer in Raleigh. He graduated with a degree in history from Duke, where Craig and I have a touch point. We were both editors of the student newspaper, approximately 25 years apart. Yes, but reflected glory is still wonderful, so I'm pleased to claim kinship. He grew up in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, which calls itself the mushroom capital of the world. He is married to the brilliant journalist and author Jennifer Toth. They live in Silver Spring, Maryland with their son Kyle. The whole family is enjoying Steamboat this week. And ladies and gentlemen, I give you one of the nation's great reporters, Craig Whitlock.
Good evening. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Bob and Jane Stein, so much for hosting my family and I out here at Steamboat this week. Thanks very much to the seminars at Steamboat. I've had a number of colleagues and friends over the years who have come out here, and they all spoke so highly of it that I was thrilled when Bob contacted me last fall to talk about drones. In fact, I'm honored and excited to be here tonight, especially to speak with you, because this is a very, very timely subject. In good ways and bad, drones are transforming aviation and commerce and public safety and expectations of personal privacy, and all this is happening at warp speed. In fact, there have been so many developments of late that in order to keep current, I had to revise my planned remarks several times over the past couple of weeks. And just to give you a sense of this, on Monday of this week, I published a page-1 story in the Washington Post about how the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, which has been rather slow in admitting that it is a problem on its hands, the FAA is now growing increasingly worried about the number of risky incidents involving small rogue drones interfering with regular air traffic in restricted airspace. Just in the last 2 weeks, rogue drones have been reported by pilots flying over New York City, Newark, New Jersey, Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, and others that haven't even been reported publicly yet. Last week, a drone crashed into a skyscraper in Cincinnati. Another one delivered a shipment of heroin to a prison in Mansfield, Ohio, sparking a riot on the ground. Earlier this summer, drones have crashed into people on the ground during a parade in Seattle, during an outdoor festival in Albuquerque. One stalked a young woman from Tampa as she was walking out of a bar to her car, and the list goes on and on. That was the story I published last Monday night in the Washington Post. Last night, about 10 o'clock Eastern Time, the FAA finally coughed up some revelatory statistics that journalists such as me had been requesting for months. These statistics show that pilots, airline pilots, helicopter pilots, generally aviation pilots, have been reporting risky encounters with rogue drones at roughly 4 times the rate of last year. In June and July of this year, this summer, the last 2 months, nationwide, pilots reported between 4 and 5 encounters a day, close calls a day with drones in airspace where they're not supposed to be. Prior to last year, such incidents were almost unheard of. In fact, the FAA didn't even bother to track them. This is a pure reflection of a recent flood of cheap and inexpensive drones that are easy to fly that have hit the market in the last year or two. They are proving immensely popular. These are small drones weighing only a few pounds each. You've probably seen pictures of them. They almost look like, toy helicopters or something. But they're equipped with cameras. They can fly thousands of feet in the air in some cases. And they can bring down an airplane if it hits them in the wrong spot, like it gets sucked into an engine, cracks a windshield, or forces a pilot to alter course during takeoff or landing. Now, before I get too far, let me define what I mean by the term drone. My simple basic definition is this: any aircraft of any size that is flown via remote control without a pilot on board. Drones can be of all sizes. It can be from something as small as a praying mantis up to a global hawk, which is a military surveillance airplane the size of a Boeing 757. They run the gamut, everything in between. But again, what they have in common, there's no pilot on board. They're operated by someone on the ground by remote control. Almost all drones have a communications link to an operator or pilot on the ground, someone who's navigating the controls in some fashion, whether somebody who's within sight of it or somebody halfway around the world, as in the case with military drones. But that's changing too. In the coming years, we'll see more and more autonomous drones, which means the software will take over the mission from beginning to end. So if a drone encounters something unexpected, the drone's doing the thinking, not the person on the ground. Now that may sound pretty futuristic, but this has already started. The US Navy has already started to build drones that are largely autonomous to land on aircraft carriers. Last year I was on the aircraft carrier, the George H.W. Bush out in the Atlantic, where they demonstrated that a carrier drone could land and take off from a carrier by itself for the first time. Anybody who knows anything about aviation or the military, this is a big deal because aircraft carriers are very big. They pitch up and down in the seas, so it's difficult to land for a regular pilot, let alone a robot. But it worked, and we're going to see more and more of this. Now, most people in the drone industry and in the military hate the word drone. They absolutely loathe it. They prefer lots of other acronyms like RPA, which stands for Remotely Piloted Aircraft, UAS, which is Unmanned Aircraft Systems, UAV, Unmanned Aircraft Vehicle. They just don't like the word drone, primarily because it conjures up images of flying robots armed with missiles that blow up terrorists. And there is that image. And that's not a good image if you're in the drone industry trying to sell lots of these kind of aircraft for peaceful, noble purposes. But personally, I think drone is a perfectly good and reasonable descriptive word. When I say drone in an article in the Washington Post, most people know what it means. And most people are coming to learn more about them all the time. Regardless of what you prefer to call them, these robotic aircraft constitute a sweeping new revolution in aviation. And I don't use the term revolution lightly. Simply put, robotic aircraft or drones are the biggest development in aviation since the jet engine, maybe even bigger. The first part of this revolution occurred over the last 20 years and has transformed warfare and military operations. Now there's a similar revolution going on right now in the civilian world for businesses, consumers, and other government agencies. In the coming years, drones are going to change life in ways that we're only beginning to comprehend. I'm a just the facts journalist. I'm not a pointy-headed futurist, so that's not my territory. But it's clear even to me that drones in very short order are going to revolutionize transport. They'll be able to deliver pizzas, medicines to rural areas, Amazon packages to your doorstep, Also cargo planes. FedEx and UPS will love having their big cargo planes piloted by robots. The military already has cargo helicopters that it uses to transport supplies to troops in remote parts of Afghanistan. So it's not hard to foresee, even in 10, 20 years from now, how airlines will move people on drones. They won't need pilots, just passengers. You all sound like you're doubting. It makes your goosebumps rise up a little bit, doesn't it? But that's where we're heading. Equally important, drones are going to revolutionize surveillance. Along with amazing advances in flying remote control have come amazing advances in cameras and sensors. These sensors can detect heat patterns, UV light, acoustics, and of course video, real-time video of what's going on in the ground. And again, the military first developed this, and now they're being used for civilians. These cameras are so powerful and advanced, it's really hard to describe in layman's terms. The military has cameras on its drones that can zoom in from miles away. You don't even see the drone, the Predator drone over Iraq or Afghanistan. When it's spying on somebody, it's not like it's right above you. These things are several miles away, zooming in, can do facial recognition, read your license plate, things like that. So those are military-grade cameras, but even the small ones that are being sold on the drones that you can buy online or buy in a hobby shop, those are beyond anything you had when you had some powerful camera, a Nikon camera, anything like that. These things have a magnification ability that are really startling, and they can transmit this video or data in real time to someone on the ground. The Air Force has something called Gorgon Stare, which is a sensor, a camera with 16 different eyes on it that can rotate all at different angles and take pictures of an entire small town at the same time. They beam these torrents of data down to a station on the ground where they store it. They can detect patterns of life of everything going on in this town over a period of days or weeks. This is the kind of advance that the military's already been doing, but it's going to come to the private sector before too long. Surveillance is also boosted by the fact that drones can stay aloft not just for hours, but for days. Already, private companies are developing drones that can run on solar power, and that these things will be able to run for days or weeks without coming back down. And they'll recharge themselves, and they can transmit data down the whole time. That's the kind of revolution we're talking about. So again, the technology advances have been rapid and stunning, and it's hard to overstate it. What hasn't kept up is policy making, regulations, and common sense. And that's going to be the heart of my talk tonight. The biggest problem right now with drones is safety. Despite incredible enthusiasm among entrepreneurs, big business, technophiles, military, and hobbyists, they're not quite ready for prime time. They crash a lot. They fly out of control a lot. This goes for big drones and small drones. When I was reporting an investigative series for the Washington Post last year on drone safety, I was stunned to discover just how common it was for Air Force Predator drones, usually armed with Hellfire missiles, to lose their communication links with pilots on the ground and fly out of control. In several cases, Predator drones flying over Afghanistan simply vanished into thin air. Nobody ever saw them again. Today, the same thing is happening on a much larger scale with small drones, with the quadcopters and rotorcopters that only weigh a few pounds. There's a new term for it, flyaways. People buy a drone, take it out to the park, and sometimes they lose the connective link, and off it goes into the wild blue yonder and never comes back. Or maybe it lands in somebody's house, or who knows, they're hard to find. Someday, drones are going to share airspace seamlessly with regular planes. They, in some ways, could be safer than aviation than we know it now, but there's a lot of basic hurdles to overcome first. The second biggest problem, which may be even harder to address, is privacy. The laws on the books that we have at the federal and state level aren't even remotely sufficient to deal with the ramifications for violations of personal privacy. It used to be that fences could ensure privacy. Build it high enough or have enough of a perimeter, you could keep prying eyes away from what you were doing in your backyard or your business or whatever you wanted to keep private. Well, drones, with their ability to have these cameras that can peer in at pretty great distances, and their ability to hover not very high above the ground, are rendering fences and other aspects of protection obsolete. Right now, I could fly a drone over your backyard, and if your daughter or granddaughter is back there in a bikini by the pool, I could take pictures of it. And while this is probably going to make a lot of people angry, right now that's probably legal. There's not a lot that you could do to stop it. Now, take that with a grain of salt. I'm not a lawyer, but depending how high the drone flew, how much of a nuisance it was, but if it kept up high enough with the camera, you know, that can happen. Before I go a bit further, I think a personal aside is in order. I'd like to explain a bit how I got started covering drones. My beat as a reporter for the Washington Post is to cover national security in the Pentagon. As part of that, I started covering drones about 4 years ago, and the reasons were pretty simple. The Obama administration was embracing drones as a new weapon of war, but it was extremely secretive about how, when, and where they were used. The more I dug into the subject, however, the more apparent it became that this was going to be an even bigger challenge for the civilian world, how to safely integrate drones into the national airspace. Even more apparent was how little attention other journalists were paying to the subject. So I persuaded my editors to let me delve not into the subject of just of military drones, but into how the FAA and how this revolution was going to unfold at home. And the result was this 3-part series that Gary mentioned that we published last summer titled Hazard Above, When Drones Fall from the Sky. Not very subtle, I know, but that was the title. Now, in the interest of transparency, I need to make a couple of disclosures. My employer, the Washington Post, has a vested stake in this subject. Along with other media companies, it wants to have the right to use drones to help cover the news, to obtain video footage of events from the sky, sort of like TV news helicopters now, except it would be much cheaper and much easier to operate and churn out tons of video online. The FAA isn't quite allowing this yet, but it will. It's already opened up, allowed a consortium of media companies to test drones under specific conditions. But soon enough, the Post and CNN and all the TV networks and even the Steamboat Today will have their drones, and they will be covering events, and they will be posting that video online. In addition, I need to point out that the new owner of the Washington Post is a gentleman named Jeff Bezos. He is also the CEO and founder of Amazon.com, which is the biggest retailer in the world. As you may have heard, Amazon is pushing hard for the right to deliver its products to people's homes with drones. So instead of waiting for UPS to deliver a book or the post office or any other package weighing less than 5 pounds, a drone could bring it to your front porch. Pretty revolutionary, but believe me, they're working very hard on it. Which brings up another side story. When Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post in October of 2013, I was in the midst of this major investigative project on drone safety and how they represented a real risk to the national airspace. 2 months later, the Post's new owner, Mr. Bezos, went on 60 Minutes and pulled back the curtain on Amazon's previously secret drone delivery project. He made it clear how much he loved this new technology and how the FAA was moving much too slow and holding back progress. Then, to make things even more interesting, a few days after that, Maureen Dowd wrote a column in the New York Times poking fun at Bezos and his drone dreams. She also couldn't resist including this line: "It will be interesting to watch the Washington Post cover new owner Bezos as he takes on the FAA over drone regulations," end quote. This could have been an awkward moment. Here I was neck deep in reporting this expose that wasn't exactly in tune with the commercial interests of the new owner who pays my salary. So I went to my editor's office with a copy of Maureen Dowd's column just to see how he'd react. To his everlasting credit, he said, "Okay, here's what you need to do. You need to put aside everything else you're working on and focus exclusively on this drone project. Our credibility as a news organization is on the line here. We can't afford to get beat on this subject. You need to make sure you publish your findings before anybody else. And you need to make sure it's the best investigative series you've ever done. And that's what we did. And to the everlasting credit of Jeff Bezos, to my knowledge, he's never breathed a word of concern or complaint about all the articles we've published about drone safety. I'd like to offer a little history now and context for the drone revolution that we're seeing. Drones go back decades. They aren't just a completely new invention. The military was flying planes with no pilots on board during World War II on an experimental basis. These were controlled by radio. Remote control model aircraft, RC aircraft, that's been a hobby for decades, for generations of people. Those aren't easy to fly, but people who do it safely and well. In a way, that's a kind of drone. What changed are some technical advances perfected by the US military. Just like the Defense Department invented the internet, the Defense Department has been the technological midwife of drones as we know them today. One big advance was GPS, or Global Positioning Systems, so that by bouncing signals off a satellite, a drone can navigate itself, knows exactly where it is. The other big advance have been communications link, whether by radio or satellite. The military developed what are called remote split operations, where it can transmit communications links to drone by satellite from halfway around the world. So someone in Nevada can fly a Predator drone over Afghanistan. 21 years ago this summer, the revolution in military aviation began inauspiciously on a runway in El Mirage, California. There was an insect-shaped aircraft called the Predator, and it went on its maiden flight, and it performed miserably. Stayed aloft for about 14 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than Orville Wright managed at Kitty Hawk in 1903. The results, though, were good enough for the Pentagon. They said, we want to buy 10 of these experimental reconnaissance aircraft and send them to the Balkans, where we're fighting with the Serbs. This was known as the Predator, and it stood out for one thing it didn't have, which was a pilot on board. The Predator drone was ugly, it was slow, it flew about 100 miles an hour, and it was pretty unreliable. But it quickly exceeded expectations, and within a decade, it had transformed the very nature of warfare and spawned a lucrative new defense industry. Today, the Pentagon has about 10,000 drones of all types, from something they call the Mosquito, which is about this big, to that again of a Global Hawk, which is about the size of a Boeing 757. The irony is that for many years, the Defense Department saw drones as a fringe capability, not a central part of its force. The Air Force saw drones as backwater, low tech, nothing for fighter pilots or bombers. And it took time, but finally they came to the realization this was a central part of their operations. In fact, things started to change at the end of George W. Bush's administration. I was in Peshawar, Pakistan in the summer of 2008 to report on the fruitless search for the hunt for Osama bin Laden. And the story I wrote at the time talked about a curious new trend that the CIA was carrying out more drone attacks in the Pakistani tribal areas. There had been 11 of these drone attacks in 2008 compared to just 3 before. Little did I know at the time just how much that would change, and under Barack Obama, CIA drone missions in Pakistan increased exponentially, becoming the primary weapon in counterterrorism operations around the world. The military embraced drones as well as a critical component of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In short order, the military gained more experience than anyone else in the world in flying drones of all types. Now, all these defense contractors and technophiles saw enormous commercial potential from this new technology. The commercial applications would be enormous. Already forecasts are that an $80 billion global market will develop over the next decade or so. The question, though, quickly became, how do we do this safely? How do we integrate drones into US airspace without screwing up the busiest and safest airspace in the world? This job was, of course, for the FAA, but the FAA was moving at a global pace. It didn't take it very seriously. It was complicated and hard. The FAA likes to go slow and careful with new technologies rather than risk messing things up in the airspace. So it handed out a few permits for experimentation for government agencies of fly drones, but it moved pretty slowly. So lawmakers who heard a lot of complaints from people in the drone industry finally had enough. They told the FAA, we can't miss out on this technological boom before the rest of the world masters it. So in 2012, just 3 years ago, Congress passed the FAA Reauthorization Act. It's a big law that gives the FAA all sorts of money and power to do its job, but a major section dealt with drones. Congress told the FAA to integrate US skies with drones by September 2015. That's next month. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing Congress did was that they told the FAA not to impose any regulations on model aircraft owners. These were the remote control aircraft operators, the people who built their own airplanes and flew them by remote control out in parks and had done so safely. He said no regulations on hobbyists or people who do this for fun. And that's a big loophole that's now coming back to haunt us. Congress's law set into slow motion a complex regulatory process. FAA, for the moment, decided, okay, we're going to ban commercial drone use until we can come up with new rules, the rules of the air, so to speak. And by commercial, I mean anybody, any business who wants to use drones to help make money, they needed to wait till the FAA could develop rules for under what conditions people could fly them. The FAA moved pretty slowly in this regard, but finally, under huge pressure, they developed proposed regulations for small commercial drones early this year in February. Now, in Washington, if you want to get out news that if you're a government agency or a politician and you're not comfortable with it or you want to bury the news, you do it at night or on the weekend. And so what the FAA did is they announced these new rules on a Sunday. Not too many people at the FAA usually work on a Sunday at the home headquarters, but they did this on Sunday, and not just any Sunday, but Sunday over President's Day weekend. So as you can, I don't have to be too cynical to tell you, they were feeling the heat and they didn't want people to pay too much attention to this, but this was a big deal and virtually every news organization in the country wrote about it. And what these rules were is, under the regulatory process in Washington, they then have to take another year, 18 months to obtain public comment, review the feedback before they can finalize them. But what the FAA did is they drafted rules that would make it relatively simple for private businesses, real estate agents, aerial photographers, police departments, farmers, anybody else who wanted to fly a small drone for commercial purposes. This drone would have to be under 55 pounds, so they call them small drones. 55 pounds is not tiny. If you get hit by something weighing 55 pounds, it's flying 50 miles an hour, it's going to hurt. But this is the divide they gave. They said bigger drones than that will be years down the road, but they're going to start off with small ones. And the proposed rules were this: the drones could fly no more than 100 miles an hour, would have to stay below an altitude of 500 feet, to reduce the risk of colliding with other aircraft. They would have to be prohibited from flying over bystanders not directly involved in the operation. And they would also have to remain within what they call line of sight. In other words, either the drone operator or somebody else that posts on the ground would have to see it. You couldn't just fly it 5 miles away. Now this is actually pretty restrictive. So a lot of companies like Amazon or others who want to fly over longer distances or without those kind of restrictions, they're going to have to wait until the FAA can gradually get to those kind of uses down the line. But so those are probably several more years away. But those days are going to come. In addition, the FAA said they will consider a separate set of rules for what they call micro drones, or drones that weigh less than 4 pounds. And those are a lot of toys that people see from hobbyists and people just flying them in the park. And under those rules, operators would not have to pass any kind of test. They would just have to submit a written statement to the FAA promising that they were familiar with basic aviation safety and that they wouldn't fly them in near airports or in places they're not supposed to. So really, a voluntary system. That's not much different from what's in place now for individuals. Demand for these drones is huge. To meet demand, the FAA said it would use a loophole in the law to give special permits in cases deemed to be especially low risk for commercial purposes. So since last fall, the FAA has given special exemptions to 1,000 commercial drone users. These are Hollywood filmmakers, pipeline inspectors, insurance companies like State Farm. They want to inspect roofs of houses or buildings. They have all been, Bruce here is one of 1,000 he's got his aerial photography business. He was just telling me he got his permit. So again, slowly but steadily, these uses are happening pretty quickly. I'd like to go back to the issue of safety for a bit here. Until recently, the national debate over drones centered largely on their military utility, whether it was ethical or not to use drones to hunt down terrorists, whether drone strikes amounted to assassinations or were really just a precise way to bomb the enemy without inflicting casualties on innocent bystanders. I'm not going to rehash all that today, but for years I covered those issues at great length. And in doing so, one of the biggest challenges in reporting was to try and penetrate the culture of secrecy that the Obama administration has wrapped around its CIA and military drone programs. Now, some of this was for obvious reasons. The CIA program is covert. That means the government denies that it goes on, even though it's widely known. But some of this was also because it was just easier not to talk about it. The military normally has no problem talking about fighter jets when its F-16s take action against an enemy target. But when it came to drones, the military zipped its lips and wasn't going to talk about it at all. It was sort of like the Manhattan Project. In particular, the Obama administration was secretive about where it was basing drones overseas. They didn't want to tell the American people where it was waging war with the drones. And it didn't want to trigger a local backlash in those countries. So it just didn't talk about it. They weren't covert operations, they were military ones, but they wouldn't reveal a word about it. And as a journalist, I have a different view. I think the American people deserve to know what their government is up to, and particularly if they're waging war in the name of the United States people. So I spent a lot of energy trying to figure out where the drones were. And in 2012, 3 years ago, I stumbled upon a chink in the armor of secrecy. For decades, the US military, and in particular the Air Force, would conduct a very extensive safety investigation whenever one of its aircraft was involved in a crash or a severe accident. And under long-standing military policy, these investigative reports were public records. The idea being that if a $40 million fighter jet crashed, the taxpayers deserved to know why and how it happened. These reports are meticulous. They run hundreds of pages. They have crash scene photos. What the pilot ate for dinner the night before, toxicology tests, everything you can think of. They're extraordinarily thorough reports. Well, it turned out that in addition to regular aircraft, the Air Force, when a drone would crash, would do the same kind of investigation. It saw drones as no different from any of its other aircraft. And under military long-standing policy, these reports are public records. It's just that nobody had really asked for them before, with a few exceptions. But nobody bothered to ask for them, but I did. I thought, well, this is great. I can find out where the drones are crashing. Maybe that'll give me some insight into where they're being used. And this was a basis for investigative stories we ran in the Washington Post to reveal the existence of drone operations on the Horn of Africa, in the Seychelles, in Europe, and other parts of the Middle East. And so I was very pleased with myself. I had finagled my way through military records to write this very thing that the government didn't want us to know about. But I soon realized, in reading through all these reports, that I was missing a bigger story. So the reaction was, wow, these things are crashing a lot. There's a lot of these reports. And it wasn't because anyone was shooting them down. They were just crashing for all sorts of oddball reasons. And around the same time that I discovered the existence of these drone crash reports, Congress passed the Faa Modernization Act, decreeing that civilian drones be integrated into the national airspace by September 2015. So this was kind of alarming. Congress was legalizing drones, And yet it was apparent that these aircraft were prone to having all sorts of accidents, and nobody, not Congress, not the FAA, not the military, not manufacturers, nobody was talking about safety. The presumption was that drones were safe and represented this huge advance in technology. Now I found out that the Defense Department and FAA shared safety data. The Defense Department, after all, had more experience flying drones than anyone in the world by far, millions of hours. But they didn't want to let anybody see it. They said, no, that's none of your business. So what if this is, in the public interest to document the safety data? So what I had to do is I had to obtain as many of these investigative reports into drone crashes as I could under the Freedom of Information Act. I obtained more than 50,000 pages. It took about a year. And to do so, then I constructed a database documenting every single major military drone crash dating to 2001. We wanted to know how many, where, why, how, what kind of patterns there were to these drone crashes. And that the result was this 3-part series we published last summer, Hazard Above. And we published an online database with details of every single crash that we could document. And what we documented were more than 400 large US military drones had crashed around the world in accidents since 2001. And virtually none of them had ever been made public before. And as we wrote at the time, this was really a record of calamity that exposed the potential dangers of opening American skies to drone traffic, not just military traffic, but civilian drones. What we also found was really since the outbreak of 9/11, military drones had malfunctioned in a myriad ways. They fell out of the skies because of mechanical breakdowns, human error, bad weather, you name it. There wasn't one little problem that could be fixed to keep them from crashing. There were all sorts of problems. So we were able to document this not just overseas, but in the United States. Turned out that military drones have been crashing in the US. They would take off from military bases, often out west where they were training operations, and they'd crash at home. They'd crash into runways, highways, waterways. In one case, there was an Army drone that crashed in Pennsylvania in the front yard of an elementary school. This was about 15 minutes after the kids let out from school. This kind of thing, again, raised our eyebrows, what was going on, what was going to happen. So in doing our analysis of all these accident reports, here were some of the problems we found: that drones had some fundamental safety hurdles that had yet to be overcome. They had a limited ability to do what people in the aviation business called sense and avoid. Even though they have these cameras and sensors in the cockpit, a drone didn't have a pilot's eyes, ears, smell if there was a fire to see if something was going wrong. Didn't have radar on board, they didn't have transponders. If they were zooming in on another aircraft, they couldn't necessarily tell. If you have a pilot on board, you can see, but the drones couldn't see. And this is something that is being worked on now, and probably in the coming years they will develop technology that can be fitted onto even small drones to help them do this, but they're not there yet. Another problem we found was pilot error. Even though the Air Force, which trains pilots better than anybody in the world and goes through a lot of training when it's drone pilots, found out that flying drones were much trickier than people think, like playing a video game. It wasn't like that. The Air Force licenses its drone pilots, it trains them constantly, but mistakes are still very common. The other problem we found were persistent mechanical defects. Drones, the generators would wear out, the oil would leak, and imagine all these things going on in flight cause them to crash. The other major problem that still hasn't been overcome are unreliable communications links. Drones are dependent on radio signals or wireless transmissions to relay commands, navigational information, usually by satellite. When it works great, but those connections can be fragile. And the records show that in about a quarter of the worst cases, these links were lost or came down. So these are all problems that affect all sorts of drones, not just the big military ones, small ones too. You see these same kind of patterns. These accident records show just hair-raising case after hair-raising case that, again, when you read the reports, even as a layman, make your hair stand on end sometimes. One thing that the reports would contain were transcripts from the stations where the pilots on the ground were flying the drones. And drones are often called unmanned aircraft, but they require people on the ground to fly them for the most part. When they crash, there's a lot of human drama. And the transcript of the cockpit conversations on the ground, which were recorded, were pretty revelatory in some cases. These weren't people saying, oh, here it goes, who cares, it crashed again. They were really, the emotion was strong. I'll read you a few quotes that we got, what's going on? Hang on, uh-oh, bleep, it's spinning. Okay, I think it just fell out of the sky. That was the unidentified pilot of a Predator that crashed in Afghanistan 2 years ago. Here's another one in Douglas County, Nevada, of an Air Force pilot flying a training mission. We're in the soup here. Dude, we're not sure what the aircraft is doing. I can't see. Oops, we just crashed. Here's another Predator pilot just before takeoff at Jalalabad Air Base in Afghanistan to his navigator next to him. He said, just before, while the drone's going down the runway, just before taking off, stop saying uh-oh when you're flying. It's never good. Because this guy apparently said uh-oh a lot. It's like going to the doctor or the dentist. Uh-oh, what the bleep do you mean, uh-oh? Sure enough, 30 seconds later, whoa, I don't know what the hell just happened. And in that case, the drone crashed into some cinder block buildings. Luckily, nobody was inside, but can again show you the danger that would happen. So these were human moments. I'm not saying to make light or fun of people, but there are some safety problems with these things. Now, after last June, when we published this series in the Washington Post called Hazard Above, we also reported on a new phenomenon, one that hadn't been made public before, which is rogue drones being flown in US airspace by private individuals. These weren't military drones. These are, again, back to these small drones that were appearing in restricted airspace near airports or above 400 feet where regular airplanes were flying through. Up to that point, the FAA had publicly said they only knew of one case in which one of these small drones came close to a near midair collision with an airliner, and that was in March of last year near Tallahassee, with the US Airways regional airliner reported this. When the FAA disclosed that at the time, there was a lot of pushback from people in the aviation community who said, oh, that's at 3,000 feet, a drone couldn't go that high, maybe the pilot didn't know what he was seeing, maybe it was a bird, very dismissive. We obtained records from the FAA, which they had kept secret through the Freedom of Information Act, showing that, well, in fact, in the past that year, there had been 15 other cases that airline pilots and commercial pilots had reported of coming within close proximity to drones. And in many of those cases, they were near midair collisions, like within 100 feet, 200 feet. This had never been made public before. In another set of records that we got from NASA, of all people, they had a database of confidential complaints filed by pilots and air traffic controllers, which reported 50 other close calls of improper flight operations involving drones. This is just last summer. We're talking a few dozen cases. Since then, this problem has really exploded. In November, we reported on another risky trend, and this was drones over sports stadiums. You may have remembered the Super Bowl this past year. The FAA was running public service announcements. This is a no drone zone, the Super Bowl, right? People would laugh. Well, at a lot of NFL games, particularly college football games, people would fly their drones over it. Now, this was a slightly different, even though these were hobbyists flying them for the most part, the FAA has had a long-standing rule restricting any flights over stadiums with more than 30,000 people on game days. And this went back to 911. They didn't want any flights of any kind going over a stadium with that many people on it. So they had a rule on the books that would say you can't do this even if you're a hobbyist. This was a real problem, and not only was it happening, but it's very difficult to enforce. A few weeks later, the Washington Post published another story. We'd obtained more data from the FAA about the previous 6 months of rogue drone incidents in the national airspace near airports. Now, I'd been pestering the FAA for this data for a few months, saying we want some fresh data. We want to know, clearly this is a problem. We're hearing about more of these cases. What, you're tracking them now. How many are there? Now, you remember how I told you about in Washington, government agencies, when it's bad news, they like to release it at night or the weekend or something. Well, in this case, the FAA didn't do it at night. They didn't do it on the weekend. They released data on Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And what they did is they just dumped out a couple of spreadsheets, very technical with dates, and figure out where, so I had to scramble in a matter of hours to put together a story. Now, the FAA maybe thought they were being clever, but of course the end result was the Washington Post and some other news organizations published stories online Wednesday afternoon and in their Thursday editions. And of course, this is when everybody's traveling for Thanksgiving and not set off a mini panic, that people are saying, oh my God, I'm flying home for Thanksgiving, am I going to run into a drone? Fortunately, there were no incidents over that weekend that we knew of, but this is where the FAA's media strategy backfired on them a little bit. Well, what it turned out is that during that previous 6 months, the number of close call with drones was again going like this. There have been about 25 episodes since June in which not just pilots seeing drones where they're not supposed to be, but within, again, what they would call a near midair collision, meaning the drone came within 50, 100, 200 feet, to the point where the planes are moving so fast there's no time to respond, to react. You just have to hope you miss it. Now, that said, there have been no documented cases where there's been an actual collision in midair. We've really been ducking this all this time. But given the rate, the number of instances this is happening, so we have to assume it's just going to be a matter of time. Now, Wednesday night, 2 nights ago, the FAA released more data. 10 o'clock at night, Washington time, they released the number of incidents with drones in prohibited airspace since the last time they did, the day before Thanksgiving. And what they reported was that the numbers have essentially quadrupled during that time. And again, just to give you some descriptions, this is a US Airways shuttle flight coming into Kennedy Airport. Reports, coming in for a landing, reports a drone, maybe 4 or 5 feet in diameter, within 100 feet. These kind of things are happening again and again. Yesterday, in Fresno, California, a helicopter, a medevac, a hospital, a medical evacuation type helicopter, reported coming within 25 feet of a drone as it was trying to land with a patient. And the patient had been snake bit in the mountains. So he was lucky the second time they missed the drone. He was luckier than he was with the snake. But this is a problem we're hearing time and time again with medevac type helicopters, because unlike airlines that go to airports, take off and then go up pretty quickly, medevac helicopters need to land at low elevations, low altitudes, in cities and all over the place, and they're running into a lot of interference with drones. Now, I want to get, as I head toward the end of my talk, I want to go back to privacy. Besides safety, the other big problem that Congress has not confronted or resolved is the impact of drones on personal privacy. And essentially, when it comes to drones, no one should have any expectation of privacy if they set foot outdoors. Not just public spaces, but private property, because these cameras and sensors will see things never before considered possible. The Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts have ruled over the years about how close you can do surveillance with, say, police helicopters, law enforcement airplanes. And again, I'm no lawyer. Bob carries a copy of the Constitution in his pocket. I don't. So take this with a grain of salt. But it come to a standard where essentially, in fact, there was a Colorado Court of Appeals case 20 years ago involving a guy who was growing marijuana in his backyard, and the sheriff's office was surveilling it. I guess you don't have that problem anymore. You can, but there was a legal precedent set where the sheriff's airplane or helicopter came down to 200 feet above his backyard, and the court said that's too low. And they said the reason that's too low, here are the two factors that they said this is not permissible. The guy with the marijuana had a reasonable expectation of privacy to 200 feet because of the noise from the aircraft would be too loud. It was apparent there was a helicopter right out back. And the infrequency of those kind of flights, those things don't happen very often. So the court ruled that there was a reasonable expectation of privacy at 200 feet. Now 400 feet, 1,000 feet, courts generally held that was okay if you were in law enforcement, that this wasn't a violation of anyone's Fourth Amendment's rights to do that. Now with drones, that turns everything upside down, because drones don't make as much noise as a helicopter. To use just that two-pronged test the Colorado Court of Appeals used, they can fly around pretty quietly. They can also fly, they're supposed to fly under 400 feet. So as we're going to see more and more of these types of flights, again, the courts are going to have to revisit this. It's going to come back to them. They haven't heard drone cases, but it's going to happen. And they're going to have to make some determinations. Congress hasn't done anything about it. There have been all sorts of bills introduced, but they haven't gone very far. And as you can imagine, it's a contentious issue. Now, just to give you a sense of how this is playing out in the industry, 2 years ago, I was at a conference. The drone industry has a trade organization called the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems Incorporated, AUVSI, and they have a big trade conference, and 2 years ago it was in Washington, and they had a professor there from Embry-Riddle University in Florida, which is, does aeronautics, or experts in aviation, and this one professor, his name was Dr. Eisen, was talking about this privacy, and for a lot of drone advocates like him, he says the laws on the books are perfectly good at the moment. We don't need to change any of that. We can live with the law in the books. We can live with having that. His argument was there should be no expectation of privacy if things are in plain sight, using equipment that's available to the general public, not just military technology, but that the general public can buy. His argument was what's on the books now says that's perfectly legitimate. Now you can imagine the kind of problems that's going to cause with people. That's just starting to sink in with most people in the United States, that their expectation of privacy is going to be very different when it comes to drones. Just in the last month, so you can imagine people are going to sometimes take the law into their own hands if they see this happening. Last month, there was a homeowner in Kentucky outside of Louisville who saw a drone buzzing over his backyard and flying over the neighbors' yards. He had teenage daughters who like to lie out in the backyard, so as you're probably guessing, yes, he got out his shotgun and he shot it down. And the guy whose drone it was very upset, and he called the sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department filed charges against the guy with the shotgun. And they said, firearms violations within the city limits, you can't go shooting off your firearms like that. And even though that guy was really mad, he said, look, this thing's hovering over my backyard, it can't be here. The sheriff said correctly, we don't have any basis to charge the drone owner. This isn't the first time this happened. There was another guy with a shotgun in New Jersey last year in Cape May. There was a drone flying around the beach house, and he got out a shotgun and shot it down. There was a guy in Modesto, California this spring who did the same thing, and again, he was charged with a crime. I suspect this kind of thing is going to happen more often, but as it stands now, those people are generally the people shooting are in the wrong, according to the law, and the people flying the drones are okay. As this professor from Embry-Riddle University said at the drone industry conference, he said, I say force the hand, find out what the courts are willing to accept. Personally, I feel the law is on our side, and it's in our interest to go to court if somebody wants to challenge our right to fly drones in the national airspace. He said, you don't own the airspace above your home. If a UAV, meaning a drone, is in the airspace above your house, there's not a whole lot you can do except complain about it. So again, you can see the kind of friction this is going to bring up. Now Congress, as I said, they've been a bunch of bills, but it hasn't done anything so far, and I think, you can imagine Congress if it's a good day, it finds it's hard to come to agreement. On something like this, it's going to take a while. The White House hasn't done much either. In February, President Obama directed an agency within the Commerce Department to work with companies in the drone industry to develop a voluntary code of conduct for the private sector regarding surveillance and privacy protections. People can have their own opinions on that. I would say a voluntary code of conduct sounds great for most people, but of course it's voluntary and it's a code of conduct and there's going to be people who don't follow it. At the moment we have a patchwork of state laws that are coming in place that say contrary things about where and when you can fly drones, and we're going to keep seeing that happen. So what to do? I'll end with this. As I said in the beginning, I think we need more common sense. There's been a relative lack of that involved when it comes to safety and surveillance. But Congress is going to have to act. There have been some bills put forth that I think are probably promising, but they're going to have to do a couple things. For safety, they're going to have to give the FAA some sort of authority to regulate hobbyist drones, meaning these people who fly them without regulation at all. And they're going to have to give them some ability to set basic safety standards for manufacturers so that when the manufacturer builds a drone, there's a certain reliability built in. Just like with other consumer products, you can't just build a drone that's going to fly away randomly. There has to be some reliability. On the privacy front, I think, frankly, the president punted on this. A voluntary code of conduct isn't going to cut it. And I'm afraid we're going to see, as I mentioned, more shotgun vigilantes. And I'm afraid for Congress to wake up both on the safety and privacy front. I'm afraid they're going to not take action until something awful happens, whether it's some kind of collision that brings down an airline or a plane or something like that. Congress did get a little worked up last January when there was an incident you may have read about in Washington when a drone crash landed on the lawn of the White House. And that in some ways was kind of humorous that this happened, and certainly ironic given that the president was known for his embrace of drones as an important counterterrorism tool overseas. But even the White House didn't have the defenses to stop a little 5-pound drone that some guy who had been drinking was up at 3 a.m., lost control of it, and it crashed at the White House. So if that's going to happen, I imagine it's, you can brace yourselves for more incidents like that. And hopefully Congress will act before it gets too bad, but that's where we're headed. Thank you all very much for your time and your interest. I'm happy to take as many questions as you'd like.
Yes. Thank you, Craig, very much. Illuminating thoughts, and we have questions that we would present to the speaker, and we encourage you to fill out the cards that are being passed up and down the aisle by our extremely valuable volunteer ushers. And one of the questions that a couple of us thought of is for people whose drones penetrate restricted airspace, airports, the White House, other things, are there penalties, or will penalties in fact do any good in this area?
It's a really good question, Gary, and one we've been writing about of late. In fact, just on Monday, I interviewed the administrator, the boss of the FAA, Michael Huerta, and one of my questions for him was, okay, these public education campaigns are all well and good, but why don't you fine some people? Why don't you, penalize some people who are flying near airports or places they're not supposed to? Because best I could find out, the FAA, again, this is something they don't like talking about, but they've only levied fines in maybe 4 or 5 cases the last couple of years. And this is a question even the drone industry is harping on with the FAA, saying they're too light, that they need to take some action to deter people from doing this. Education is great, just to publicize the rules, but there's always going to be some people who ignore it, and there needs to be some action taken, and that's part of the debate right now. What should be done? Now, there's two responses to that from the FAA. It's hard to catch people who are flying drones in places they're not supposed to, because the drones don't have, unlike firearms, they don't have serial numbers. Unlike regular planes, there's no identification number on them. So if a drone crashes, all you know there's a drone. You don't know whose it was, unless there happened to be a video camera card on there with the pictures of somebody. It's hard to figure it out, because the guy who flew the drone and crashed is usually far away, so it's hard to track them down. But in cases where they do, where people are repeatedly violating the rules, that's a big question a lot of people have, is why isn't the FAA taking a harder line to deter this?
Great. Can you clarify the drone use in national parks? The person who wrote the question says, I visited 2 parks recently. There was no information or literature to advise on drone use in the parks.
Well, last year, and I was talking to somebody with the Forest Service here, so he can correct me if I'm wrong, but last year the Department of Interior announced a ban, a prohibition on drone flights in national parks, and I believe that applies to Forest Service land as well. And the reason was a lot of people were coming to, iconic national parks like Yellowstone or the Tetons or Rocky Mountains National Park, and they want to take pictures, right? Everybody wants to bring their camera to the national park and take pictures of Old Faithful or the bears, and well, what better way to take video than to have the drone you just bought? The problem was, as you might imagine, the drones were crashing or flying into people, or in fact, at Yellowstone, I think a few of them flew into geysers. So the National Parks Service said, we got to put a stop to this. This is too dangerous. My understanding, and again, I could have this wrong, is they're considering revisiting this or coming out with some sort of other regulation that would permit it under certain circumstances, but for now, there's a ban.
There's a ban. The issue of hackers taking control of our computers, and in one test case, taking control of an automobile, are there hackers who can take control of drones? Or a related question, are there ways to jam signals so drones can't communicate?
A great question, and the short answer is yes. I talked to one who took control of a drone, a hacker. He's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, a mechanical engineering professor. And last year, he notified the Department of Homeland Security. He says, you guys need to watch it. This is a real problem with, they call it not just hacking, or they call it spoofing. And where that is somebody on the ground sends signals to the drone in the air, making it think that you're the pilot. So it's taking over the controls, spoofing the drone into thinking it's the pilot, and then you can program in, well, we want you to fly into that building, or we want you to fly into the ground, or something like that. So they can take the controls. The other thing you can do is jam the signals. And then the drone, if the signal's jammed, it either takes some pre-programmed route or it can just crash. So yes, that's a problem. It's not a problem just for consumer ones, but this professor at the University of Texas told me even the drones that the Department of Homeland Security flies along the borders of the United States, that he thinks those are susceptible to spoofing and hacking. So this is, he says as soon as drone use becomes much more common in the United States, particularly with businesses flying it, he says he thinks the hackers will be coming out of the woodwork and will see this as an irresistible target.
On terrorist groups, this is commercial this is technology that is becoming commercial off the shelf. Good old COTS in our Pentagon vernacular. Obviously there are risks. Is there any evidence of terrorist groups, particularly international terrorist groups, seizing on this technology?
Yes, again, clear evidence. And I don't mean to smile and take it seriously, but again, these are real concerns. A couple years ago, there was a defendant, a suspect from Boston, who was charged with the FBI of plotting to operate a drone carrying some small amount of plastic explosives and using it to attack targets in Washington. They arrested him before he got very far. On July 31st, just a couple of weeks ago, the Department of Homeland Security published an intelligence bulletin which said that they're increasingly concerned about the potential for terrorist groups and other malign groups, as they put it, using drones for nefarious purposes. They had recorded more than 500 incidents dating back to 2012 of drones being used to conduct surveillance on sensitive sites around the country, whether nuclear power plants or military installations or places like that. And that's surveillance, but still, again, you can see the potential for trouble. And just to add on, the Washington Post a couple years ago, you may have heard of Edward Snowden and the intelligence he leaked to the Washington Post and to the Guardian in the UK. Well, in some of the documents that he provided to the Post, there was actually evidence from the NSA, the National Security Agency, that Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda Central, meaning Osama bin Laden's core group, had sent out requests to Al-Qaeda followers around the world, asking them for the brothers who have good engineering minds who can help us take advantage of this new technology in drones for their purposes. So there's no question that the desire is there on those groups to use these sort of things. We haven't seen it happen in a great scale, although there have been reports out of the Middle East of late where groups like Islamic State or ISIS have at least used these off-the-shelf drones to conduct surveillance. And there's no reason to think, why wouldn't they do that? These are available anywhere.
There was a case several weeks ago involving drones interfering with firefighters on the blaze along I-15 in California. And where does the law stand? Where's the responsibility stand in a case like this?
Well, that's a really good question. That case sparked a lot of outrage. For those of you, I think most people have probably heard of this, but firefighters who are flying aerial tankers in particular in San Bernardino County would have to ground the aircraft for up to 15, 20 minutes at a time because there'd be a swarm of drones coming by, these sort of thrill seekers, people wanting to take video of the wildfires and the efforts to fight them. And this, of course, is a real problem. This resonated back in Washington to a very strong degree, and I think that's one reason the FAA has said they're going to, when I talked to the FAA chief on Monday, he said this is something we're going to have to crack down on. This is just unacceptable. Now, legally, that's a really good question, though, is you can charge somebody with being reckless in their operations in the air. And that's something the FAA has the ability to do with anybody who's recklessly interfering with air traffic can be charged, and it can be a felony in some cases. So those people could be charged, but as far as I know, they haven't been discovered yet. I believe the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors even posted a $75,000 reward for information leading to the apprehension of anyone flying these drones. But again, like I said, they're hard to track. Is
it possible, well, it is possible, is it practical that manufacturers could include some kind of identification so that drone owners could be, you could find out who was operating a drone if you seize a drone or find something that's crashed?
Well, they could, but it wouldn't be hard at all to make people register their drones when they're bought. Like you have to do, if you buy a car, you have to register your car, and people know, if a car is used, they have to own it, or, they can track people, there's not a firearms registry, but firearms can be traced given their serial numbers. That isn't the case with drones. The government hasn't required it. The manufacturers don't want to do that. The FAA says this wouldn't be practical for them to have a national drone registry because there's so many out there now. There's estimates that there's already been 1 million of these small hobbyist drones sold in the country. And those numbers are just going to continue to climb. But that's a very good question. I think maybe there has to be some way, at least a serial number, so they can tell who bought it originally. Yes, there'd be bureaucracy and paperwork involved in that, but given the number of incidents we're seeing, it seems like an idea worth exploring.
Is that likely initiative to do that? Is that likely to be a federal initiative or a state-by-state initiative?
A great question. In fact, I asked the FAA chief about this on Monday, and he was sort of saying, well, maybe the states ought to do it. That I don't have the manpower. That'd be a great idea if the states wanted to do it. States license cars, maybe they should license drones. But again, we get back to this patchwork of regulations and laws, and nobody's thought it out. And you could see this coming. a year or 2 years ago, you could see that these problems were going to crop up. But again, like I was saying at the beginning of my talk, common sense and public policy just haven't kept up with the advances in technology.
Two questions. The U.S. is probably the leader in applications of drones because it was developed by the military and therefore we have the technology. But it's a big wide world. And what are other countries doing?
Another great question from a military standpoint. Israel, China are two countries that are very advanced in military drone applications. The Israelis in particular, they sell their drones to customers around the world, and they're quite good at it. And there's no question the technology, the United States had a huge lead compared to the rest of the world, but it won't take that long for them to catch up. And in fact, the hobbyist type drones we have are the ones that most most companies will want to use. Most of those are made overseas. The biggest manufacturer of small drones is a company called DJI, which is a Chinese company. And they've figured out how to make them cheaply and quickly. And another big manufacturer is Parrot, which is out of France. Again, their biggest markets are in the United States. But both at a military perspective, all sorts of countries want to own and operate these now because they cost less than fighter aircraft. They give them enormous surveillance capability, but also from a commercial or consumer basis, they're being sold globally.
Are police anywhere? Are police beginning to use drones? Is it moving forward?
Another good question. They have been on a limited basis. In fact, for years now, law enforcement agencies have been able to get a special permit from the FAA to operate drones for surveillance purposes. They call them certificates of something or other, but it's a little bit laborious, but they can put in an application in the FAA to operate drones, but they have to spell out exactly where and when and under what conditions, and these would have to be renewed. So some sheriff's departments, police departments, and the FBI, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Homeland Security, they've all had permits for some time, but they're kind of laborious and difficult to use, and a lot of police departments, I think, wanted to do it, but it became a little complicated. And then they also had the public policy questions. At a state or local level, when a police department says, police chief or sheriff says, hey, this is great. I can do surveillance. I don't have to send a helicopter up, which costs a lot of money. Maybe I don't even have a helicopter surveillance. I'll just get a drone for $2,000 that can fly around. But again, the public policy issues, then their board of supervisors, the county commissioners, the city councils, like, wait a second, we don't know that we want to take that step yet. Maybe, everybody, the voters don't want us to be flying these over their backyard. So that slowed things down. I think we're going to, no question, come to the point in time where this will become a very common tool for law enforcement. Again, not only are they cheaper to use than police helicopters, but they can stay above for long periods of time, for hours. You can track people almost indefinitely. So they're a tool that are going to be used, but I think the public policy questions have to be sorted out before they will become pervasive.
What has often happened with police departments is the introduction in technology is actually financed by government grants, federal government grants out of the Justice Department. Is there anything along the line of promoting drone use coming from the U.S. Justice Department?
That's a good question. I don't know of grants being used to promote drone use, but I'll give another answer that sort of gets at the same point, which is that one of the federal agencies that has a drone fleet that operates fairly regularly along the borders, of course, is Homeland Security, the Border Protection, Customs and Border Protection. They have what are essentially military Predator Reaper type drones. And one thing we reported on a couple years ago is that they loan these out at pretty high rates to local law enforcement, to sheriff's deputies, to even fish and game departments, things like, if there's a local law enforcement agency, or to look for lost hikers, things like this. So a lot of local agencies are saying, we need a drone, there's something going on, and they'll ask the federal government, Homeland Security, will you essentially loan us one? And that's happening not infrequently.
You mentioned court cases about drone use it was part of the criminal justice system, people saying you should suppress this evidence because this isn't legal. Is there any, and you mentioned concerns at the local level, at the city council level about city council, county levels about use of drones. Is there any kind of civil libertarian movement that's addressing this at the time? Oh,
no question. I think the civil libertarian organizations, the ACLU, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there's a lot of, they've been helping to try and penetrate this aura of secrecy that the Obama administration has put out, just to find out how many permits the FAA has issued to local law enforcement to fly drones. The FAA didn't want to disclose any of this for years. It took lawsuits under the Freedom of Information Act filed by these civil libertarian groups just to find out how often these were being flown and when. In fact, the FBI for years refused to say, even to members of Congress, how many drones it had, when it flew them, and under what conditions. And it's taken lawsuits by civil libertarian groups to just find out some of that basic information. The FBI, by the way, finally disclosed this past year that they have a small drone fleet. They wouldn't even say what kind, but I've heard from other groups there's something called Pumas, which are maybe about 20 or 25 pounds, can fly overhead for hours at a time. And they've used them in operations around the country. The other interesting thing was the FBI disclosed that as far as it was concerned, it never needed a warrant to conduct surveillance. You laugh, but this is their legal basis. Their justification is when we use these in operation, we don't need a warrant. Again, it gets back to the question: if they fly them high enough, they think there's no reasonable expectation of privacy.
Great. We have a last question. Would you consider the drone industry to be a good investment?
I think I'm going to refrain from answering that one. I think I'll refrain from answering that one because, one, I just don't know, and I don't want to give out bad advice, but that's a very interesting question. And I can say I don't have any investments in the drone industry, but don't take that beyond just a general lack of funds to invest.
Hey, thank you, Craig. Fantastic talk, and delighted to have you here.
Thanks very much.